everyone. This week we are talking about qualitative data. I hope that you are so excited. I'm excited. I love qualitative data. It is really exciting, really interesting. It's where we dive deep into the subjects that we are studying. However, qualitative data is its own special thing, and most researchers try and stay away from it if possible because it is time consuming and expensive to collect, and the analysis is hard. Recruiting people to participate in qualitative data is hard. Training a team to go through a qualitative data study is difficult. So typically we won't collect all the data we need for a research project using qualitative methods. Typically this is used to supplement some quantitative methods. So maybe you will conduct a survey, and then as themes arise, you will conduct interviews or focus groups to explore those a little further. Or you might flip it. You may want to collect or conduct a survey, but you're not really quite sure which topics to touch on. You might conduct a few key informant interviews so that you can get an idea of where things need to go before you actually write that survey and get started. So let's jump into qualitative data. Okay, first, what is qualitative data? The academic definition is that it's non-numerical data that can be recorded, observed, and describes qualities and characteristics. I don't know about you, but that is confusing. So let's break that down. Basically, qualitative data is detailed. It's not multiple choice. It tends to be either spoken or if you were to look at a Google Forms and it says short answer or paragraph, those are considered qualitative data. There isn't one right answer, and the answer between all the participants is not going to be the same. You use it to gain a deeper level of understanding. So if you think of quantitative data as surface level, quantitative data is like survey data, something that is multiple choice. So that is surface level. You can cover a variety of topics broadly, so like long and skinny. Qualitative data is where you dive deep. So it's like you take this little section like this, and then you just go as deep as you can into that particular topic. It does require hands-on data collection. You can't send out an electronic interview because then it would be a survey. Sometimes you may have a survey or something like that where you're asked to provide some qualitative answers, but typically not all of it. It requires that the researcher be involved in the data collection as it is happening, or it requires that the researcher hire someone to do that for them. And that's the case sometimes with focus groups and interviews. You may hire a professional focus group moderator or a professional interview to collect that data. But if possible, the researcher is watching from an undisclosed location, or they have prepped and trained the person who is actually collecting the data. And qualitative research is collaborative. So it is basically a conversation between the researcher and the subjects. So depending on what the subjects say, that will change what the researcher does next. The type of questions they ask, if they take it a completely different direction, things like that. And the analysis is subjective. We cannot run a numeric analysis on qualitative data. Instead, we look for themes in the qualitative data and put things in different buckets, basically, so that we can see what topics came up. You will be doing this, not this week, but next week, I think. At some point, you will be coding a focus group, or you will develop actually, you probably won't do that. But typically when you create a focus group, then you will create a code book for the focus group. That means you'll go through the focus group transcript, you'll read everything, and you'll say, these are the 10 themes that I saw in this focus group. And you will go through and highlight those themes and then basically drop those quotes into the separate little categories. There are computer programs like in vivo that can help you do it. But this is hard. Qualitative research is something that a lot of professional researchers and academics shy away from because it's expensive and it is hard to collect this kind of data. Okay, so our main types of qualitative data are observation, interviews, and focus groups. Like I said, for your class project, you will be doing a focus group. So that's the one we're really going to dive into. The main difference between focus groups and interviews being that interviews are one-on-one and focus groups tend to be groups of 8 to 10. Okay, let's talk about participant interactions. There are basically two types of participant interactions in qualitative data collection, and this is the unobtrusive or non-reactive. That's the first one. It's typically linked with observation. So the intent is to avoid contact between the participants and the data collector. So this may mean that as the data collector, you don't talk to the participants. It may mean that you are behind a two-way mirror, whatever it is, you are observing, but you're trying not to let the people know, or trying not to draw attention to yourself so that participants are likely to continue their normal actions. If you think about it, you can think about it in your normal life. I know I sometimes want to know what my children are doing, and we have these little cameras throughout our house, but I don't want them to know that I know what they're doing, or I don't want to disturb them. So I have this handy baby monitor. I thought I did. I have this handy video baby monitor that I can see what is happening in Oliver's room and whether or not he's sleeping. But I don't have to go in there, and he doesn't know that I'm watching him, because if he did, then he would freak out and start crying. So you can think of unobtrusive or non-reactive observation kind of like that. The observer is seeing what's happening, but they're not participating in what's happening. And their intent is not to change what is happening or to change behavior. And then you have the interactive or participatory type of interaction. And this is focus groups and interviews. This is where the participants are going to interact directly with the researcher or data collector. And this is the one where the conversation is going to evolve organically. So the moderator or interviewer may have a list of questions or themes they want to get through, but what comes next happens because of what the participants say. So let's talk about observation. This is our most basic source of knowledge. It requires the observer to be aware of the cultural context. They have to have an idea of what is happening in the larger world before they can make assumptions. They need to maintain a distance so as not to influence behavior. We talked about that. And we also talked about this with the Hawthorne effect a couple of weeks ago with validity. And then they need to focus on interactions rather than numerically quantifiable events. So what does this mean? They're not counting something. They're looking at the interplay between people. How are people communicating? How do people respond to this particular situation? We're not looking at how many times someone blinked or how many times they did a particular action. We're looking at what influences them to do that action, or what is the result of that action. There are two types of observation, two basic types. One is unobtrusive or direct observation. It is where the observer sees what's happening, but they don't interact directly with the participants. One way to help with that is that the researcher will kind of stay away and not necessarily camouflage themselves, but do things to blend in. Another thing is to create familiarity with the researcher, because that starts to reduce changes in participant behavior. So if we take my kid example again, if my children are familiar with the video cameras, then they will start to ignore them over time. At first, there might be an impact on behavior, but over time, that becomes the new normal, and they just start acting how they normally would. You see the same thing when you introduce an observer to a group of people. Initially, the behavior may change, but as they learn to just be aware or be familiar or more comfortable with the idea of someone watching them, behavior returns to normal. And then there's the interactive or participatory observation. And this is when someone embeds themselves within whatever group it is. So they come in direct contact with study participants. It requires that the researcher develop relationships with the subjects so that they can see those more intimate parts of people's lives. How do they interact with their family? Things like that. The problem with this is you have a difficult time maintaining the cultural norms and balances, and the researcher cannot become so embedded that they either start to offer advice or that they start to change. I'm trying to think of a good way to say it, so that they change their own way of thinking to match that of the community that they're embedded in. A really silly example of this is where you hear about FBI going undercover or someone going undercover to live with a different group. And then as a result, they pick up behaviors that they should not have otherwise picked up. That's kind of the idea. Interactive participatory research requires learning about the study participants firsthand, but there are some concerns with that. So what are some of the ethical considerations for observation? This is a little bit tricky because when we think about observation, we think, well, we're not doing anything to anyone, so why do we have to have ethical considerations? Well, in research, you always have ethical considerations, and we will talk extensively about that in a few weeks. But basically, ethical observation requires that the researcher disclose that they are a researcher. They're not just a random person in the community, and they must tell people that they are under observation. They also must be open to questions from participants. They need to answer those honestly. They cannot lie. They cannot become an authority figure. We talked about that. They can't, Again, they can't lie, and they must maintain balance between being an insider and an outsider. And we talked about that as well. There's a difference between living with the community or embedding yourself within the community and actually being a part of the community. And it is really important to reduce bias that researchers remember that they are not actually part of the community. Okay, so how do we get the right data from observations? We saw a couple of weeks ago with the video that getting the right information is hard. One thing to do is to create a list of things to look for during the observation period, before the observation period. Another is to take notes, and not only take notes, but to record or film the observations discreetly so that you can go back through a second time and verify that the observations were done correctly. And then finally, add to notes as soon as possible after the observation. It's really easy to forget things. And in the moment, you may be taking shorthand notes or not very detailed notes, but as soon as that ends, the researcher really does need to go to a quiet place and add as much as they can remember. We typically get our data from field notes. And there are some things that we need to do to improve those field notes. One is to add the date, time, location, and setting of the observation, because while you think you will remember that, you will not, especially if you are doing a similar observation multiple times. You need to describe the people that are observed. Again, if you are doing this multiple times, you may have slight variations in the people that are being observed, and it's important to know what results came from which group. You need to describe the process or the interactions observed. It's important to be able to describe what is happening, and you need to work through and label all of your thoughts and impressions after the fact. And then finally, you need to develop a working hypothesis based on observations. And then once you have all of those things done, you can plan for the next steps. Okay, so we talk about observations, and then as we move more into that participatory research realm, let's talk about key informants. We often have interviews or focus groups with key informants, partially because it saves us time and money. Key informants are willing to talk to the researchers, and key informants typically have a better idea of the whole picture of the situation than just an average person off the street. So key informants are insiders with a special knowledge, status, communication skills who are willing to share what they know with the researchers. They speak to others. They often act as a liaison or the voice of the people. They work very closely with the researchers. They might provide interpreting services, provide some cultural contacts, and introduce them to important people within the community. And having a key informant is critical to providing researchers with access to accurate information in a qualitative study. You need someone that you can return back to and say, does this seem right? You also need someone who has an inside track, who can help you talk to the people you need to talk to as the researcher. So we need to identify and work with key informants. There are two ways to identify key informants. There are two approaches. One is formal, so they're somehow assigned to you. If you think about a research project that maybe goes through a school, typically you'll be assigned a key informant. It might be a vice principal, a teacher, someone that the organization has identified as having good information that needs to be passed on to the researcher. But the way that we typically identify our key informants is through informal means. Informal means are preferable and they're used most often. You ask community members for their input on who the subject matter expert or SMEs are on a particular topic, and then you request information from community participants throughout the course of study. So it is better for the community to identify their key informants than for you to just select someone who seems to be high up in an organization. When you work with a key informant, initially you need to develop basic questions before conversing with them, like, what do you do? Who do you talk to? Who comes here? And then you can start to incorporate those questions into a more casual conversation. Remember that key informants are not infallible. They are subject to their own biases, experiences, and interpretation of events. So as cliche as it sounds, you need to take information from key informants with a grain of salt. So once we move away from observations, we start to prepare for focus groups and interviews. And while focus groups are a group and interviews focus on one person, the basic structure of what you need to do to get ready is the same. So the first thing you need to do is identify the research problem. And this can be thought of as identifying the research topic. Then you need to decide on the type of research question. And to do this, you need to determine the focus of the study. And that can be attitudes, opinions, experiences, those kind of things. Qualitative research questions tend to be more of these attitude, opinion, actions based than a black and white research question. You need to then break the topic into answerable research questions. This may mean that you have one umbrella question, like, I am currently working on a research project where I look at what the impact of LARC or what the long-term impact of inserting LARC immediately postpartum is. So inserting long-term, long-acting reversible contraceptives. So something like an IUD or an Explanon immediately after giving birth. What is the impact of that? So I have that broad question, but then I need to break it down into something that's a little more manageable. So I have a sub-research question that looks on what is the financial cost, another one that looks at what is the societal cost, and a third one that looks at what the comparison is between a LARC insertion 6 weeks postpartum and LARC insertion 12 hours postpartum. So With your qualitative questions, they'll be a little different, but again, you need to break your umbrella question into manageable, answerable research questions. And then after you have that research question, you start to develop main questions, then follow-up questions and probe questions. So you have that main topic, and then you decide what are the main things I need to know in order to answer the research question, and you develop some follow-up questions so you can dig a little deeper depending on where the discussion heads. There are several types of qualitative questions. The first is experience or behavior questions. This is where you're gathering descriptions of experiences, behaviors, and actions. And you may frame a question like this. You say, how would you talk to first-time mothers about immediate LARC insertion? That might be my experience behavior question. Then you have opinion value questions. These look at how people interpret events and issues. It looks specifically at your decision-making process and reveals information about opinions, norms, and values. So you may say, what do you think about LARC? Feeling questions, these are supposed to elicit an emotional response to experiences. These questions may be unplanned. So you may be asking an experience or value question, and then for whatever reason, head into that feeling side, because these tend to develop in response to other questions. So maybe you are talking about your opinion of immediate insertion of LARC, and you then the follow-up question would be, how did you feel when you were approached by your provider about this topic? And then lastly, knowledge. They're used to understand a participant's factual understanding of an issue. So you may ask them to tell you about whatever it is, so you can see if what they're telling you is accurate or not. Again, qualitative research is often like a conversation. So you'll have the main topic, it focuses on the main theme, it's helping you answer that research question. Then you'll have a follow-up question, it just moves it to a deeper level. But you can't really know what follow-up questions you are going to need to ask until you start talking about the main questions. So it's important as you are writing those interview and moderators guides that you have some ideas of follow-up questions, but that you are flexible enough if you need to pivot a different way. And then finally, you'll have a probe, which moves the conversation even deeper, where you might say, and then what happened? Or tell me more about that. You're not really asking a question, you're just asking for elaboration. With the probes, you need to make sure that you maintain that fine balance between getting the information and digging too much into someone's personal life so they feel uncomfortable. Interviews are conversational partnerships, and it's an interactive data collection process. There are three types. There are structured interviews. Those follow a strict script or interviewer's guide. Unstructured interviews are informal and conversational. They're guided by maybe a few broad topics. You're going to say, hey, today we're going to talk about your experience with contraception following birth. And then kind of go from there and get people talking. And with this, both parties, so the researcher and the participant, are responsible for keeping that conversation going. And then you can have a semi-structured interview, which is a hybrid between both the structured and unstructured. It uses an interview guide, but there are open-ended questions, and it is okay if every question isn't answered. So the stages of interviews and focus groups, again, these are very similar to each other. It primarily deals with the number of people being or talked to at one time. So number one is you need to create a positive environment. You need to hold your focus group in a location where people feel comfortable enough to talk. And given that it's 2022, that location may actually be Zoom. Then you need to state the objective of the conversation. So why are you conducting this focus group or interview? You need to set the expectations or rules. So we will wait for people to raise their hands, only one person talking at a time, whatever those expectations are, and also give them a time limit so they understand. Then you'll go through a sort of introduction phase. You might do an icebreaker question, some kind of introduction, so people have a better idea of who they are working with. Then you'll show some understanding. So I understand this is a difficult topic, whatever. You are trying to create less distance between the researcher and the subjects so that they are willing to talk to you. Then you're going to move into that main data collection part where you get the facts and descriptions. Notice how many steps have happened in a focus group before we ever start collecting facts. And then finally, you come up with some sort of conclusion, and this is where you wrap it all up and make sure that you understood their responses correctly. In order to have a good focus group or interview, you need a good moderator. So good moderators have the ability to put people at ease, build rapport, project unconditional respect and acceptance, convey warmth, empathy, and enthusiasm. Think about someone that you've talked to. Maybe it's a teacher at church. What did they do to make you want to talk to them, to make you want to participate? Those are all the things that a good moderator does. They should also have excellent verbal and interpersonal skills. You want a nice person to be a moderator. You don't want someone mean, because the participants will shut down. You want them to be able to listen and to actively listen and appear that they are listening. They need to be aware of their own and others' nonverbal reactions. Their reaction could bias the study, and so they need to be able to control their face. Basically, I would be a terrible moderator because I cannot control my face. And then finally, they need to be able to interpret and explore participant responses within the context of culture and societal norms. So this interpret and explore part means they need to be able to think on their feet. So if someone gives a response, they need to be able to come up with the follow-up questions so that they can dig a little deeper. Focus groups, this is what we focus on. They are data collected from a group of people in one setting, and they depend heavily on group interaction. So the role of a focus group moderator is almost the same as what we just talked about. They can also be called guides or facilitators. They introduce topics, ask follow-up questions, and probe for additional information. And they set the tone for the discussion and enforce the rules. When should we use a focus group over an interview? We should do this when we're setting social norms or expectations, when we need people to share ideas or debate, kind of when things are polarized, or when we are wanting to gather information from quite a few people with different opinions. Focus groups are a great way to go. They're awesome with controversial topics because people love to talk. And they're great when you want to collect qualitative data, but you kind of need a lot quickly, because think about it, each interview is 45 minutes, but one focus group that's 45 minutes gets you data from 8 to 10 people. When you conduct a focus group, you need to follow the following procedure. Before the focus group ever begins, you need to set up the room. You need to test your equipment to make sure it's working correctly. Greet participants, collect their basic information, and set up any data collection or note-taking instrument. Then you need to start the discussion. That will include the introduction or icebreakers like we talked about. You'll describe the tools that you're using. So if you have a tape recorder, you're going to show participants that. If you're recording it via video, however, whatever tools you're using, you need to let them know. You'll explain the purpose of the study. You will review the statement of informed consent, which is basically things will be kept confidential. Their names will not be associated with it. Do they want to participate? Yes or no? You'll encourage confidentiality when applicable. You'll describe the process. So you'll say, like, we're going to ask you a series of questions, and we'll be doing this for about 45 minutes. Please raise your hands, or however you want to handle those little details. And then inform the group of the anticipated length of discussion. That's the last thing. Then you'll get started. So you'll begin with some kind of warm-up question that is related to the topic, but not necessarily your main topic. You need to be aware of who's contributing and who's not. So do you have one person that's dominating the conversation, one person that's never spoken? What can you do to draw that one person into the conversation? And what can you do not to stifle, but to give the other person a chance to just hush for a bit so others can talk? You need to use broad, open-ended questions. Yes or no questions are not good in a focus group because it will end really quickly. and it doesn't allow you to probe for more information. One thing in a focus group, it is okay to allow silence. If people are quiet for 30 seconds, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are asleep or don't care. It might mean that they didn't understand the question or that they're thinking. If 30 seconds passes and no one says anything, you probably need to restate the question and start looking at those nonverbal communications. Maybe people are uncomfortable, maybe they don't want to answer for some reason. You need to reframe that question so you can get responses. Then you need to end the discussion. When you end the discussion, you'll thank the participants, you will remind them how the information will be used, and you will collect all digital recordings and any written notes. And then lastly, after the focus group is all the way over, you need to expand on those notes. This is like the observation. The note taker and the moderator need to sit down immediately after the focus group and write down everything that they think was important. Then you need to transcribe those recordings and then review the transcription and the notes to see if anything was missed and start that data analysis. So this is a really quick version of qualitative data analysis. It will make more sense as you conduct your own focus groups. I cannot wait to hear how that goes.